Next, we'll hear from Ms. Ludwig. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Paulson, Ranking Member Heinrich, and members of the committee, good morning. Thank you for your leadership in convening this hearing. Thoughtful bipartisan discussion on implementing opportunity zones is essential so that this important new tax incentive fulfills its founding goal to revitalize our nation's communities and further economic growth. I'm Terri Ludwig. I'm the CEO of Enterprise Community Partners, and I've worked in financial services, capital markets, real estate, and community reinvestment for 30 years. Enterprise's perspective on opportunity zones is based on our deep expertise as a national leader in affordable housing and community development finance, and specifically as an investor and lender deploying capital in communities. For more than 35 years, Enterprise has amplified the impact of investment in homes and communities by engaging the right partners, directing public and private capital to the right places, and offering nonpartisan guidance and support to government leaders. We've invested $36 billion in equity, grants, and loans in all types of communities in all 50 states. We've built or preserved 529,000 homes, helped create diverse, thriving communities, and touched millions of lives. We foster economic mobility and opportunity through a high-impact investment portfolio that includes not only affordable homes, but also health clinics, schools, and access to healthy foods and access to public transportation. I'm honored to share Enterprise's views on realizing the public policy goal that gave rise to opportunity zones, bolstering inclusive, sustainable economic growth. This new tax incentive has immense potential to transform communities, grow small businesses, and better residents' lives, provided that investments are aligned with local priorities and needs. Enterprise has strong expertise in aggregating private capital and deploying it through programs like Low-Income Housing Tax Credit and New Markets Tax Credit. We're eager to realize the potential of opportunity zones to complement these established public-private partnerships. Enterprise is exploring opportunity fund models that would foster inclusive economic growth and prosperity for residents and businesses. Our goal is to demonstrate that capital can be deployed to deliver compelling financial returns and social returns. Any fund we create would incorporate best practices drawn on our work over the past 35 years. These include investments that develop and preserve affordable housing, create living wage jobs, support minority and women-owned businesses, and expand transportation and infrastructure. We've been working very closely with governors, mayors, investors, and community-based organizations on opportunity zones. We've gathered and shared data, disseminated critical information, and provided technical assistance. And what we've seen is that while communities are excited about this catalyst for economic development, they're also concerned that private investment could unintentionally displace the very residents and businesses that the tax benefit is intended to support. Enterprise believes that there is an important role for federal, state, and local government to play in the implementation of this tax incentive. This will ensure that investments advance local policy priorities and needs and offer sustained benefit to all members of the community, not just a few. To support this, we offer two main recommendations for the effective implementation of opportunity zones. First is promoting the transparency of opportunity fund activities in order to drive accountability and assess impact on communities. Specifically, we recommend requiring that opportunity funds report to Treasury on transaction-level data and that this information be made available to the public. Doing so will allow Congress to evaluate whether the tax benefit is meeting its intended policy goals. Second, the Department of Treasury should use its statutory authority from Congress to issue regulations to prevent abuse. Enterprise suggests that the definition of abuse includes investments that adversely affect low-income residents, for example, by eliminating affordable homes. Such guardrails will help ensure that current residents and businesses benefit from economic growth in their communities. I provided more detail on these recommendations in my written testimony and look forward to addressing those in Q&A. To conclude, we are enthusiastic about the promise that opportunity zones hold for urban, rural, and all types of communities nationwide. If implemented with transparent reporting requirements and the explicit commitment to prevent abuse, opportunity zones could have a transformative impact on distressed communities and, most importantly, on the lives of the people who live there. Thank you for your willingness to openly explore the benefits and the risks of this new tax incentive. Enterprise would be pleased to work with you further on these issues and on our recommendations to realize the great opportunity inherent in opportunity zones.
Thank you, Ms. Ludwig. Mr. Jones, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Paulson, Ranking Member Heinrich, and members. There you go. Sorry about that. Chairman Paulson, Ranking Member Heinrich, and members of the committee, I'm pleased to join you this morning to discuss Opportunity Zones. My organization, the Local Initiative Support Corporation, or LISC, championed the Investing in Opportunity Act legislation that became the foundation for this initiative, and we are pleased that it was enacted last December as part of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Over the course of LISC's nearly 40 years of work, its comprehensive approach to community development and its broad national reach have made it a servant leader in the fight to improve quality in communities across the country. LISC's greatest success over these years has been working with under-resourced communities and their residents to help them make progress. Today, the growing inequality, concentrated poverty, and racial inequity that our country is experiencing make the work that we and our partners do as urgent as ever. LISC attempts to catalyze opportunity by working at the local level to foster resilient, safe, and healthy communities in which individuals have financial security, economic choices, and a high quality of life. With our roots that are local, national breadth, and a comprehensive set of products and services, we fight to close the opportunity gap in America through a strong network that we work with of over 2,300 community-based partners. LISC often relies on public-private partnerships to engage in the type of comprehensive community development work that is needed in low-wealth communities. And it's precisely because we've seen firsthand the impacts that tax incentives can have on spurring community revitalization, most notably the low-income housing tax credit and the new markets tax credit, that we believe opportunity zones hold a great deal of potential. We are planning to focus our opportunity zone investments in 3 areas where we see the greatest potential to benefit community residents. First, we will provide growth capital for companies that are creating job opportunities for opportunity zone residents. We will inject equity capital to catalyze the growth of manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, healthcare, and companies in other growing sectors that are providing quality job opportunities that are accessible to community residents. Second, we will invest in new real estate developments and rehabilitation of existing underutilized buildings within targeted communities to attract businesses, bringing quality jobs to underinvested communities and their adjacent neighborhoods. And finally, we will increase the stock of quality, affordable, and workforce housing in opportunity zones. We hope to raise capital for these investments from mission-aligned investors, including corporations located in opportunity zones, and from the growing impact community impact investment community, in particular, high net worth individuals, which would represent an entirely new pool of investor capital for community development finance. Since there's no cap on the amount of investor capital that can be invested in opportunity funds, we believe that the Opportunity Zones incentive can spur billions in private investment activity in the country's most distressed census tracts and play a major role in closing the existing opportunity gap that is leaving these communities behind. In particular, a large portion of our work occurs in rural communities, which are especially underinvested, so we are very pleased that preliminary results show that 22% at least of the opportunity zones will be in these very communities. I'd like to conclude my remarks by offering a few suggestions of how we can ensure that opportunity zones maximize chances for investors while simultaneously maximizing benefits for low-wealth communities and their residents. First, I believe Congress should consult closely with the Treasury Department during the next phase of rulemaking to identify whether there are areas that may require statutory fixes, particularly those that will provide clarity to investors and improve the flow of investments into opportunity zones. Second, I believe that Treasury and the IRS play an active role. I believe that Treasury and the IRS should play an active role in the implementation and administration of opportunity zones. Specifically, we need regulations and guidance that not only provide investors with the clarity and certainty necessary to make investments in opportunity funds, but also protect against program abuse and help ensure the integrity of the program. They should also play a role in collecting and disseminating information about the activities of opportunity funds. Finally, individual states and municipalities should work with the private sector to ensure that Opportunity Zone investments provide the most benefit to low-wealth communities and their residents. I'd like to thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to trying to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. As we begin the questioning period, just remind all members to keep their questions to 5 minutes. And just let me begin, and I'll start with you, Mr. Terri. We can just go right down the line. But the inclusion of opportunity zones in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it deserves more public attention. A lot of our colleagues aren't fully aware of it as well, because it encourages private investment to flow into low-income communities selected by the states. Now, I believe that opportunity zones hold huge and great promise to help those that are less fortunate and then achieve more self-sustaining economic development. And based on the testimony we've heard today, I think my belief's well-grounded. Let me just ask all of you this. What makes opportunity zones more likely to succeed than the location-targeted programs that have been used in the past for this type of goal? And also, do you believe that there are other market-oriented reforms at the state and the local level that enhance the chances of success? Mr. Lettieri, you want to begin?
Yes, thank you for the question. I'll focus in two primary areas. Opportunity Zones was designed as a complement to other tools. It was designed to be a new and responsive tool in the broader toolkit for community development. As I mentioned in my testimony, the fact that it is flexible to a wide variety of use cases to be able to support a wide variety of types of businesses itself is a major plus, because what we see in a lot of communities is a variety of needs. We've spent a lot of time analyzing the needs of distressed areas around the country, and no two communities look alike. And so if you have a very narrow prescriptive use case on the front end, it means you're limiting the aperture of places that can really put that to use in the community. And you see this reflected in the selection process, where governors have different needs in mind, state by state, as they go about the selection process, and they've emphasized different needs. For some, it's rural entrepreneurship. For some, it's affordable housing. For some, it's access to transit. For some, it's just new business formation, where a lot of the struggle continues to be for low-income areas. So that flexibility is key. The scalability that I mentioned as well. When you don't have a scarce resource to allocate year by year, you're talking about something that can be nationally impactful simultaneously without having to pick winners and losers on the front end in terms of who can deploy the capital. That's not to say that those models are useless. It's to say that they're not sufficient. And so having this alongside of those other types of tools is particularly powerful. And as I'm sure that others on the panel can speak to, the interactivity between opportunity zones and other tools could also be one of its strongest assets. The fact that it's flexible enough not just to meet a wide variety of needs, but to be compatible with a wide variety of other tools.
Yeah. Ms. Ludwig?
Sure. I would just echo that I support what was just said, and I believe that what does distinguish this from other programs is that inherent flexibility. And while we all appreciate the tools that are out there, I think it's very clear that the need is enormous. And so I believe this is an additional tool which allows us the flexibility to invest in various asset classes, being able to also pool resources, not only just with a single investor, but being able to pool resources across asset classes and types of investors. And that would allow us to both diversify risk and opportunities and bring more private capital. And I also agree that with further guidelines, we believe that a lot of this will pair with low-income housing tax credits, new markets, and essential tools like this. So,
and Mr. Jones, you also, I think, mentioned something about we want to prevent abuse and have to have Treasury step in and offer some additional comments. But knowing that the local flexibility is key, what are some other oriented reforms that state and local folks can do to make sure we're enhancing the opportunity here?
Yeah. Let me answer both of your questions. I agree with what my colleagues have said. Two additional things. This is a focus on equity capital, and that is key for the places that we're trying to be of service to. We need grant capital, we need equity capital, we need debt capital. The exclusive focus here on trying to get more equity in these communities is a key additional attribute. The second piece of it for me on the more likely to succeed, and by the way, I think the others are succeeding as well. We just need more tools. But the second piece of this is this focus on trying to bring in what is now a underperforming asset class in the community development space, and that's high net worth individuals, right? Capital gain, folks who have capital gains to deploy here. Our largest incentive right now is probably the low-income housing tax credit. That's a $9 billion industry. This is potentially 2, 3, 4, or 5 times greater than that. At the state and local level, look, I think the biggest thing that I could see there that would be most helpful is making sure that the states work with municipalities, the private sector, to market these places that we're trying to get investments into. This is not going to be an automatic piece here. We're going to have to work hard to market rural America so folks know that there's both demand and investable opportunities there.
Great, thank you. Mr. Maloney, Mrs. Maloney, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Paulson, for this is an incredibly interesting hearing. The U.S. economy is generally doing well, and for that we should all be very, very thankful. But as many of us know, the economic recovery is not everywhere. There are parts of the country that are experiencing the benefits of the recovery, and other parts of the country that are being left behind. And in these areas, unemployment is still high and wages are stagnant. In the area of New York that I represent, the geographical difference between the haves and the have-nots can be a couple of blocks. It can literally be across the street. So I'm very drawn to the potential of the opportunity zones to help close that gap between these two very different worlds. And I welcome the application of a market mechanism to what has seemed like an intractable problems for cities and states. This is an out-of-the-box idea that deserves very careful consideration. Language establishing opportunity zones was inserted into the new tax law, and I wish we had had time to see this language and talk about it before it happened, particularly because the language that appeared in the final bill differed from what was introduced. But that's water under the bridge, and our job now is to explore the potential of these opportunity zones and to do all that we can to help reach their full potential. My first question is for Mrs. Ludwig. The Bipartisan Investing in Opportunity Act, or as Senator Scott said, the American Act, it's not anything, it's just for America. There is some text that is different from what Senator Scott and Cory Booker introduced. The section on a report to Congress, I'd like to thank Mr. Jones and Ms. Ludwig for mentioning in their testimony that this language is missing from the final bill. That section requires the Secretary of Treasury to submit a report to Congress on opportunity zones 5 years after enactment of the legislation. And I'll provide a bare bones synopsis. I think it's important. The original bills required an assessment of investments held by qualified opportunity zone funds, the amount of assets in those funds. It also requires, and I quote, "The report shall also include an assessment of the impacts and outcomes of the investments in those areas on economic indicators, including job creation, poverty reduction, and new business starts, and other metrics as determined by the Secretary." And in short, it seems that the new tax law was missing the language requiring these reporting requirements, and I'd like to submit with unanimous consent that original language into the record and ask Ms. Ludwig, as an advocate for affordable housing, can you tell me why you support strong reporting requirements, and in the best of all worlds, would you encourage Congress to pass a law mandating reporting requirements? I know that it was in the conference report, such language that does not have the force of law. I know that Treasury is very supportive, but we know that administrations change. It'd be good, I think, to have that concrete reporting language requirement for oversight and to prevent, as Mr. Jones mentioned, any type of fraud or abuse. Your comments, please. Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you. I would agree. I believe the conference report signaled that there was broad agreement on the need to first of all, have reporting mechanisms, both for transparency, but also for the eventual ability to assess impact. And I think this is a program where there is tax benefit, and so I believe accompanying with that, there should be the transparency and accountability that comes with this. I think the conference report did a great job of outlining it, so I certainly support those impact measurements. And I think the only way that we'll be able to look back and sit, as Senator Scott said, a year from now, 2 years from now, or 5 years from now, and determine was the success of this program, and hopefully the expansion of this, and celebrate the success, is by having the data to look at where we are.
Mr. Lettieri and Mr. Jones, do you agree with her statement to have it? Yes or no? Because I have a final question that is very important to me. Would you
Yes,
support?
you need the information.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. In New York, the biggest way to impact economic development has been transportation, the ability to move in and out of neighborhoods. If you have good transportation, i.e. a subway, then it explodes with economic development. And would you support, Mr. Jones, given your background in this area, broadening this to include transportation? I must say I was very interested in President Trump's statements during the campaign on infrastructure support, which have not materialized in the budgets that we've had moving forward. So expanding this would, if the mayor and the governors supported it as a major economic force. I just know from my experience in city government, state government, federal government, in terms of economic development, that has been the major force that has spurred small businesses, activity, economic growth.
Yes.
Would you support expanding it to include infrastructure?
Absolutely. Infrastructure, transportation, and broadband in the rural areas.
Okay, that's great. I don't believe the current legislation allows that. Is that correct?
Actually, I think it could.
It's not really, I think
It's not
needs to be
explicit,
spelled
but
out.
it could. That could be an investment activity, absolutely.
I'm very excited about it. Thank you, Senator Scott, for your leadership on it.
Thank you, Representative Maloney, and Representative Handel, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Paulson, and thank you, Senator Scott, for your good work on this legislation. I'm a former county commission chairman, so very familiar with enterprise zones and the very real positive impact that they can have, and this seems to be a very promising enhancement and addition to that toolkit to help in this front. I want to talk, Ms. Ludwig, a little bit about affordable housing. As you know, since the mid-'80s, tax credits have been available for investments in low-income housing, yet we still have a real gap there. Can you talk a little bit about how you would characterize opportunity zones in relation to the low-income housing tax credit?
Certainly. First, I would say the need for affordable housing is enormous, and we're seeing not only at the state, but also all the mayors we speak to, that's the number one concern for them. So I would say, first of all, we need more resources. After tax reform, as we know, the low-income housing tax credit lost value within that, given the tax rate, and so we will, by just nature, have 250,000 fewer homes being able to be created by the tax credit. In the budget, there was an increase of 12.5% of the low-income housing tax credit, but we would say we would like to continue to increase that tax credit to be able to meet those demands of the affordable housing needs. It's our hope that the Opportunity Zone funds can pair well with the affordable housing sector, utilizing low-income housing tax credits. However, I would say that we certainly need more clarity about what is a acceptable real estate investment and what is not. It's our assumption that rental affordable housing today will be acceptable, but there's certainly the need to get more clarity on exactly, to unlock the wallets of the investors we talk to. They're eager to get started, but they need more clarity on what's an acceptable investment.
Thank you. To follow up on that, as we seek to deliver that greater clarity, are there any lessons learned from your work that we can take from the low-income housing tax credit programs and do a better job through opportunity zones?
One of the things I think that is one of the best features of the low-income housing tax credit is that it is essentially a pay-for-success model. Government, first of all, private money puts their money in first. And then once units are built and it's occupied with people that are in need of affordable housing and qualify, then the government money flows. Similarly, in opportunity zones, you're going to have private investors come in, and that's great to unleash that private capital. The reason that those private investors have been willing to do that in the low-income housing tax credit is because it's predictable, it's clear, the reporting is there, and they have a long compliance and infrastructure that helps you know that I'm investing in something that has a 15-year period of compliance where I know I'm not only getting a very healthy financial return, but also my intended investment to create housing for social returns is getting done, which is why I think we need the clarity on the reporting and as well as the some of the guidelines.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Jones, would you like to add anything to that?
I think what I would add is what you're seeing is that the low-income housing tax credit by itself is not sufficient to generate the supply of affordable housing that we need. That's what you're seeing. And so what's the opportunity here is to bring in a whole new group of investors to affordable housing finance through a new mechanism here that brings hopefully high net worth individuals into the game. Unless we get more investors in affordable housing, we will never be able to keep up with the supply needs. That's what you're seeing now, and that's why this is a real opportunity for us.
All right, great, thank you. And just one comment, I am very encouraged to hear the consensus around transparency and accountability so that we can really measure impact. Because I've seen firsthand that some projects really work and some projects do not. And this is too great of an opportunity for Americans for us to mess it up on the early front with bad projects. And we need to be really laser focused on having the best possible projects come through on this. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back and thank you.
Thank you, and Dr. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Scott and Senator Booker, for your work on this issue, and to our individuals testifying today. Thank you so much for being here. I believe that opportunity zones with the right oversight and guardrails have the potential to help underserved communities. I submitted 18 census tracts to our governor in North Carolina, Governor Cooper, to be designated as opportunity zones. I specifically targeted census tracts in the 12th district that had high unemployment rates, sometimes even those that triple the national average. However, it's clear that there needs to be more accountability in how opportunity zones are implemented. For example, the IRS recently announced that individual investors can become a qualified opportunity fund and can self-certify. Thus, no approval or action by the IRS is required. To self-certify, a taxpayer merely completes a form, attaches that form to the taxpayer's federal income tax return for the taxable year. Ms. Ludwig, should Congress be concerned that rules like these can lead to abusive opportunity zones and will not provide a positive impact to underserved communities?
I do think it's important for us to understand what is the intent behind an investor's interest in an opportunity zone fund. So I do think it is important, again, to keep the flexibility and the market-driven approach on this, which is different and distinctive, at the same time demand a minimum level of accountability, particularly of investors, to say what their intent and their intended investment practice will be.
Thank you. Franchises are also looking at the prospect of opportunity zones, and I'm eager to learn more about franchising and how franchising can accelerate business growth and local opportunity in the zones. I want to understand the prospects and the impact of franchises in areas that have high unemployment rate. 9 of my district census tracts that I've submitted to Governor Cooper had unemployment rates higher than 12%. As a matter of fact, some go as high as 18%. Can you tell us more about franchise businesses, that role and the prospect of their success in opportunity zones, especially in opportunity zones with high unemployment? And this question is for you, Mr. Terri.
Thank you for the question. I see tremendous potential in the franchise sector for opportunity zones, and I think there's tremendous potential benefit for the communities as well. We all are familiar with examples of people who got their first step on the ladder of opportunity working at a franchise, And we've also seen in the franchise industry recently tremendous growth in minority-owned franchise creation. And so I think when you think about where the map of opportunity zones and the map of and the categories of early investment models that can work and hit the ground running, I think the franchise sector offers a lot of hope there. Here again, I think it's an opportunity to get folks who are in an industry that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with opportunity zones thinking about that map in a different way and targeting certain investments and new franchise openings in a way that coincides with congressional intent here in terms of the places that have been targeted. So I think that's an area of a lot of potential. I hope we see more of that activity as the clarity comes through from IRS. And I think in particular, the overlap of the goal for minority wealth creation, targeting communities of color, as you mentioned, many of whom have very high unemployment rates. You have to have an asset class of both investments and businesses that offer an easy point of entry for people who may not be starting with the most skills, but this is a way for them to build skills over time.
Thank you. The low-income housing tax credit is a critical tool to develop and preserve affordable rental housing. We are in serious trouble in our community in Charlotte, so many folks who need it. I want to be sure that opportunity zones can be used in a complementary manner with the low-income housing tax credit, and I'd like for to ensure the maximum growth of affordable housing. So this is to Mr. Jones or anyone else who wants to answer that.
I think that's one of the big opportunities here. We're about to go down to Charlotte next week, and we're there to announce a fund that will be designed to try to bring about the development of more affordable housing in the Charlotte area. Opportunity zones are going to hopefully be a great tool in bringing investors to that fund.
Great, and we look forward to working with you. Ms. Ludwig?
Yes, and we were encouraged in working with several of the states that we were working with who said, let's be very intentional about even the selection of opportunity zones to make sure that as we do that, that we are setting very specific strategies at the local and state level to preserve affordable housing, which I think is a practice that needs to be widespread.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, out of time. Thanks very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Representative LaHood, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this important hearing today. And obviously, these opportunity zones offer tremendous potential for our country, and I'm excited to hear the testimony here today and the different ideas. And Senator Scott, thank you for your leadership on this also. Ms. Ludwig, in your testimony, you mentioned Enterprise is exploring opportunity fund models that would allow you to invest and promote economic growth. Can you explain how these specific models are composed, and then what characteristics does an ideal investment opportunity have?
So thank you. We are at the beginning stages of creating funds. We're talking to investors and localities about, first of all, what the needs are. But certainly it's our hope that we'll be able to create a fund that is very, certainly, first of all, real estate focused and specifically affordable housing. And also we're talking to investors, for example, about adaptive reuse. So going in and taking old warehouse buildings and turning that into workforce housing or affordable housing. How do we make sure that we have that piece, because that is one of the most basic primary needs of the folks that we serve, is to have affordable housing. Secondly, we're working to consider exactly what are the kind of small business capital that's needed. Is that early, more catalyst money, or is that growth capital? And secondly, we also think it's important, we've heard from a lot of folks in smaller towns and in rural communities, that they also want to think about how they could couple that with an accelerator kind of function, because they want to be able to demonstrate to private investors that they can not only catalyze new businesses, but also support existing businesses, but have an accelerator kind of function attached to that. So those are two areas that we're certainly looking at right now, but we hope that there'll be other ways we can also support communities. So we're looking for further guidance regarding things like infrastructure. In rural communities, water, sewer, infrastructure. We think about housing as infrastructure often, but we want to make sure that those, we can come up with acceptable uses. As my colleague said before, broadband, are there ways that we can support that through an investment vehicle? And simply the one item that would help us be able to get into action about having capital flow is certainty. Investors like certainty to know exactly what qualifies and what doesn't, so that we can get out of the box with investment dollars.
Thank you for that. Mr. Lettieri and Ms. Ludwig and Mr. Jones, we've heard a little bit about enterprise zones around the country, TIF districts. If we look at models or platforms around the country that have been examples of where this has worked. Can you talk a little bit about that, maybe Mr. Lettieri or Ms. Ludwig, on, I mean, is there an example or a model that you can point to where this has worked very effectively? And particularly as we look at, the components of distressed communities, no high school diploma, housing vacancy rate, adults not working, poverty rate, where those statistics have been improved and we've done exactly what we want to do here.
I think there are elements that have worked in a variety of different programs. What we've missed is, I think to Mr. Jones' point earlier, we really haven't had a robust equity investment incentive piece of previous attempts, and especially one that was coupled with the type of flexible use cases that we're talking about here. When you talk about a wide variety of needs, if you have a narrow prescriptive policy on the front end, it's very hard for that to be malleable, especially over time as communities change and develop and as the needs shift, hopefully as a result of success. And so where you see in the more recent post-recession period where you've had dramatic turnaround, you look at cities like Detroit, a lot of challenges still in Detroit, but part of that turnaround you have to ascribe to the catalyst of a major private investment initiative happening without even the benefit of a lot of federal incentive that has helped to catalyze a wide variety of other activities, both philanthropic and private sector alongside of it. Not every city has a motivated philanthropist or a motivated set of private investors who are already organized around that city. In fact, most places don't. That's the challenge. And so when you're talking about aggregating the impact of thousands of investors from around the country and being able to direct that equity capital into prescribed areas where you know the investors can count on the fact that there's intentionality. The governor has chosen these places. Mayors have had input. Stakeholders have come together. That's a signal to the marketplace that there's some kind of intentionality behind this particular place, and it presents a rallying opportunity. And it's important here that what this offers is not for any individual investor to take on the risk by him or herself. This is about collectivizing the assets and the ingenuity of the private sector to apply to those challenges. So that's really where I think this differentiates from past approaches. It's learned some lessons. I think that's incorporated here in terms of what you see with the structure of opportunity zones that you don't get as much of in other policies. That's the potential, is that you're aggregating, you're focusing, you're signaling to the marketplace that this is the right type of place to invest, and you're going to have partners on the ground that are coming alongside of you because of that intentionality that the governors have selected.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Delaney, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to join with my other colleagues in thanking Senator Scott for his truly singular leadership on this very important piece of legislation. So thank you, Senator. And I want to also thank all of our witnesses here for their work in making this happen. My first question is for Mr. Lettieri. When you think about what's happened, it seems like there's been a tremendous amount of interest among investors since this was passed into law. And so that's the good news, right? There's plenty of investors, whether they be very large private investment firms or entrepreneurs who are looking at this. How much do you worry that there'll be just a lack of deal flow coming out of these communities? Because that really seems like the bottleneck, whether there's actually enough technical expertise on the ground to produce the deal flow that all these investors are really looking for.
I think it's a great question. So among the things that would keep me up at night about this would be one of them, is that there's a reason that the economy is not working well in some places. There's both public and private sector neglect in many cases. Again, just the designation of an opportunity zone is not enough to guarantee any kind of follow-on activity. That's why it's so important that at the state and local level you have real stakeholdership on an ongoing basis from governors and mayors to develop a strategy, to partner with local foundations, philanthropies, that these are areas that are underinvested. Right. There's a lot more potential than what the marketplace reflects.
So any ideas you have for us, obviously, we'd love to hear them specifically. Ms. Ludwig, when I think about turning around these areas, I've always thought about kind of a four-point strategy, this being one of them. The second being social impact bonds, pay for success, which I know you all are big champions of. The third being more infrastructure. And kind of the fourth is creating incentive for more demand in these markets. And one idea I've worked on is dramatically expanding kind of hub zones, which is basically creates an incentive for government contractors to locate in these opportunity zones. And I think the overlap will be very similar. How do you think about that in terms of these other programs? If we were to do more in those other three areas, recognize we got this done, how much that would kind of accelerate the development of these opportunity zones?
Absolutely. I think it's going to take all of those things in some of the places that have been circled where have very high poverty rates and need long-term investment. And so I feel very strongly that we're going to need, one of the things that you're talking about is what you've seen is public and private partnerships come together in different formats to bring that kind of capital and that long-term orientation to bear, and understand that it's going to take different layers. It also takes a different set of assets. So we talked a lot today about affordable housing, but it also takes schools, and it takes retail, and it takes a comprehensive approach. And so I think those different tools allow us to bring those together to really drive the impact.
Right, and I'd love to hear the different panelists follow up with us about how they think if we could create more incentives for government contractors to actually go in these places. Mr. Jones, when I think about infrastructure, you talked a lot about the different kind of portfolio of asset classes, if you will, that we could be putting in these markets, and I think you were really smart to emphasize how this is equity, which is ultimately what you need to expand the economy as opposed to just people kind of financing existing assets. One of the things I'm focused on is infrastructure in these communities, but one of the issues with infrastructure, if I was thinking about investing in infrastructure, whether it be maybe broadband or even transportation, I'd probably come to the view that unless I was doing it in Puerto Rico, where the whole place is an opportunity zone, I would want to invest in an infrastructure kind of asset that would probably touch the opportunity zones but touch other areas. Do you see what I mean? So because just the way of infrastructure asset, it's rarely, again, other than Puerto Rico, where the whole island is an opportunity zone, so you could do any infrastructure there and it would work. How do you, do we need to do any correction to these rules to allow someone who wants to come in and build rural broadband, but the way they're going to roll it out only touches the opportunity zone and not the rest? I mean, how's that going to work?
Yeah, I think that's certainly worth looking at, although when I think about the need for, let's say, for example, rural broadband, most of the census tracts that we're talking about are contiguous and would qualify.
Got it.
And so I think
But if you invest in that, if you invest in a company that's got its assets in an opportunity zone and not in an opportunity zone, but it has to roll out that way.
Right.
Like, let's say, a transportation asset or something
Yep.
like that. How's
Yep.
that going to work?
Yep.
Does anyone have a view? Do you allocate part of the investment to the opportunity zone, or how does that work? Does anyone know?
Yeah, I mean, the statute requires the business to have substantially all of its property in a zone or
like
zone.
90%, I believe.
Right.
So it could be in multiple tracks that are all qualified, but the challenge of something that straddles.
That's what I'm
opportunity
getting
zone,
at.
You're right.
Then
Yeah.
really you're talking about, from a business standpoint, you're talking about either spinning off a subsidiary or a separate standalone entity. There may be a variety of models, but you're right, it's trickier when it comes to infrastructure because of the cross-jurisdictional
Yeah.
nature.
Yeah, because clearly, if you want to invest in an infrastructure asset, it's probably going to have a pretty big footprint, and it's likely to be in and out of an opportunity zone. So any ideas you all have as to how to, because I think this is a critical investment
Yeah.
area we want to attract, how to fix that up, that would be great.
Agreed.
Sure.
Well, and it's probably another example of an area where you don't want to have the investment happen and then think that that's fraud or abuse, or,
Right.
you know, you have to have that tie-in, so, yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Exactly, but the rules allow that, yeah. Thank you. Representative Comstock, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, and sorry I was running late. We had a women's veterans event this morning that our Women's Caucus was participating in. I welcome our former Virginia Commerce Secretary, Mr. Jones. Thank you for being here today. And I guess I'm sure you're aware of our regional area in Virginia and Mr. Delaney's area, Maryland, are under consideration for Amazon. And the Wall Street Journal recently reported that some large cities were denied by Amazon as a location for their second headquarters. And now some of them are planning improvements in response to better attract firms in the future. So, you know, things like local transit, workforce training in particular, I know was a big thing. So as we try to look particularly in the technology area and making sure what my constituent Steve Case calls the rise of the rest, you know, he's going around the country and really talking about, we know we have talent out there in the technology area. So is there a lesson, you know, what are some of the best policies you're seeing in place, and how can this be used to get these 21st century technology jobs into these distressed areas? Because often, whether it's cybersecurity or some of these other skills, you do not need to be going to college for 4 years. Not that that's disqualifying in any means, but, you know, Capital One has done some cybersecurity training programs with disadvantaged populations that have had huge success, and others. So how can we use the opportunity zones to capitalize in the area of technology for these populations?
So let me just start, and then my colleagues can chime in. One of the things that Amazon has been asking about in all the places that it has been looking is, what's your plan to ensure that we have enough supply of housing, affordable housing, right? And so what you're finding is that these technology companies know that if they're going to attract and keep talent, and frankly, if they're also going to keep goodwill in the places where they go, they've got to be concerned about things like housing and workforce training and and transportation and their impact on them. And so Opportunity Zones does provide a tool for places like Northern Virginia and Maryland and DC to actually collaborate on an affordable housing plan for an Amazon investment. So yeah, I think Opportunity Zones can definitely be one of those things that you use to make sure that you address those issues that now all these technology companies are having to wrestle with, particularly their impact on the cost of living in those places.
Right.
Thank you. And it's building on that. I completely agree that is of primary importance. And I would also say that it's our hope that Opportunity Zone funds will be created to specifically help entrepreneurs that are bringing cutting-edge technologies to bear to change, whether it's the effectiveness, the efficiency, the cost structure of the work that we do, the new ideas and the innovation that we think needs to be brought to bear to help catalyze change in communities. In order to do that, I think it's very important that we consider how we could use Opportunity Zones funding for minority-owned businesses, for women-owned businesses, as we know, have received just such a limited supply of equity capital.
Particularly in the technology area.
Particularly in the technology.
95% white male.
Exactly. So how do we do that and use this in a way that catalyzes that kind of business and that innovation and creativity that is there, that needs to be unleashed? I also feel that it's an opportunity for folks who understand our communities deeply to have them be part of those solutions and to give them capital to respond, which I think is the intent of this.
I want to build on that because as you look at the map of Opportunity Zones, many of these places have anchor institutions, knowledge centers, universities that spin off commercializable technology and IP. It's just that it doesn't stay in the Opportunity Zone. It goes to the Bay Area, to Boston, New York. And part of that, a big part of that is proximity to funders. So now you have an asset class of investors who actually have an incentive to keep you in close proximity in the community and help you scale there. One of the best things we can do for Opportunity Zone communities is to help infuse them with the technologies and industries of the future. We know that's where the economy is going, and if they're devoid of those types of industries, they're going to constantly be playing catch up with the rest of the country. Capital is a really important facilitator for that, and with that comes the stakeholdership of and expertise and mentorship of investors who then care not just about the business in the community, but the community itself, because the two are so closely related. So I think about a place like Johns Hopkins in Baltimore and the potential there. In the life sciences and technology arena, you have tremendous anchor institutions in places that have high need. I think making sure we get that connectivity right is one of the real potentials of Opportunity Zones.
Thank you. I see my time is up here, so thank you.
Thank you, Representative Comstock. I know Senator Sass just came in, and did you get yourself situated there?
Take a little bit of time to get oriented, yeah.
Yeah, and maybe as you just get oriented real quick, because you may be our final questioner here, but real quick, I was going to follow up on some of what Representative Comstock was asking about. Are there other large investment? Someone had mentioned Ms. Ludwig, you had mentioned the funds. When will we know if the funds are emerging, or Mr. I can't remember who mentioned, but when will we know if these funds are sort of beginning to? When they're out there, you know, how long will it be before we sort of have a track record of sort of following when the funds are going to be materializing?
Sure. I'll ask my colleague to maybe talk on the technicalities of the timing, but I do think that given people are going to be self-certifying, you know, it's a little bit of, we can't see that necessarily exactly. Well, what I would say is that we do see folks that want investment, people that are starting to say, both investors, they want to be coming into funds. We're seeing that kind of activity today, and they're asking us, how can you help us to create a fund that would meet our needs, whether it's at the local level, national level, or state level? Secondly, we're seeing people that are asking, does this investment meet those needs? And they're trying to start to create their pipelines, particularly in the rural areas. They're saying, in order to really compete, we know we're going to have to start developing pipeline very quickly to compete. And so that's what we're seeing already today. And it is our hope to be very soon starting to acquire assets that could go into a fund.
Yeah. Mr. Lettieri, you want to just add real quick?
I do. We're very early in the implementation process, so the fund creation is going to happen in waves, in my view. You're going to have some folks who today they know that their model works within the statute. They don't need a lot of additional clarity. They have knowledge of the deal flow in these communities. They can hit the ground running. I think the folks we have on this panel are great examples of tons of expertise in these communities. They know what types of needs are not being fully met, and they know the types of funders to target. Then there's a second wave where you're going to need a lot more clarity that we're going to have in a couple months, but we don't have it today from Treasury and the IRS. And as that comes in, a whole other wave, I think a broader aperture of folks that may not traditionally be in community development may find their way into it as more clarity from the regs comes through. And then as the market matures over time and the infrastructure in opportunity zones is created to facilitate that investment, to elevate additional deal flow, then you'll see a third wave of investors emerge as well. So I think this is a long-term process. I think this year is going to be a critical period, as it always is for implementation. But if it goes well, I think you're going to see fund creation really into the out years as more and more knowledge of this develops. In the investor community, only a small fraction of investors even are aware that this exists. Mm-hmm. So we won't really know the full answer to that until that awareness increases.
Okay.
I would just add to what my colleague said. I think the other factor that will influence how quickly funds get up and running is how aggressive at the local level, again, states and other folks are out there promoting these zones, marketing these places as places where there's both demand and investable opportunities. So what you may see in terms of speed of the development of funds may depend as much on how aggressive we are in states as anything else, because that's at the end of the day where the feet on the street will exist, and that will be the dispositive issue in this.
Okay, great, thank you. Senator Sass, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the three of you for being here. Mr. Lettieri, I'd like to look at some of the issues behind the broader need for these economic empowerment zones. In 2017, your organization highlighted three particularly disturbing trends. First, the new startup rate is at record lows, having dropped by 50% since the late 70s. Second, our economy is becoming more consolidated in larger firms. For example, the total number of firms in the U.S. from 2007 to 2014, despite population and economic growth overall, dropped by more than 180,000 firms. And third, economic growth is largely clustered in the most populous metro regions in the country and incredibly unevenly distributed across the Great Plains and the Midwest. First, could you explain sort of the background story behind that third issue? Why is this consolidation happening?
Thanks for the question. The consolidation is more a function of those major hubs being resilient than it is of them pulling away in real terms from everybody else on the creation side. And by that I mean the overall number of new business starts in the country has dropped dramatically, particularly with the onset of the Great Recession. It has not rebounded. So the latest data that we have now shows almost no recovery in new business formation rates. So we're in uncharted territory on that front. The places that have been the most resilient amidst that national decline have then the largest differentiation with the rest of the country, but it's not because they're doing better than ever, it's because everyone else is doing worse than ever in terms of the creation side of the economy. So that presents a real challenge for low-income areas. Obviously, they're among the hardest hit on the creation side of the economy. The new business formation rates there are particularly low. You see this as a regional story, the Midwest being one of those regions where, whether it's cities or rural, you have particularly low formation rates. And that's something that it's obviously a bigger challenge than what this alone can solve, but a big part of the connective tissue is access to capital. And so we don't fully understand why it's happening, but it's unmistakable in the data. We're living in a very different environment in terms of economic dynamism.
The other two of you like to add to that?
I think the other piece to add to that is a lot of this clustering also reflects where the talent is right now, or let me put it another way, where the prepared talent is for the economic opportunities. And I know where we're working in places where 70% or so of our residents have high school diplomas or GEDs, but we are testing them when we're doing our workforce work. And what we're finding is 70% of them are, despite having those credentials, they have competencies in literacy and math at the 6th to 8th grade levels. So we've got to do, this goes back to a point we made earlier, for this to really work, it's not an isolated tool. Workforce development, economic development, these incentives have to come together to create a strategy for a particular place. And the most important strategy is get the talent prepared for the opportunities. You do that, and the opportunities will come to you.
And Mr. Jones, if you were king for a day and you could put a bunch of chips on one of three bets, K-12 educational preparedness, workforce training and redevelopment for people post age 18, or sort of mobility incentives to try to think about the inequality across geography, where would you spend most of your chips?
And you're going to get me in trouble, sir.
That is not my intent, Mr. Jones.
But I like the notion of being king for a day. I would put my...
Way better than legislator.
Honestly, I would put my bet on getting people prepared for the 16 million middle-skilled jobs that this country has to fill between now and 2025 that require solid secondary education and post-secondary licenses and certifications and apprenticeships. That's where I would put my bet, because if you ask employers where they're having the hardest time filling jobs, and these are good-paying jobs, it's welders, it's coders, it's medical technicians, it's electricians, it's plumbers, it's construction. That's where I would put my bet, because it's also quicker. And our need for a prepared workforce is today, and that is for the competitiveness of the country. So if I were king, that's where I put my bet.
Ms. Ludwig.
Yes, the kingship. I would say that...
Or the queenship.
The queen, I know I was thinking queenship, but it felt strong. Earlier in this testimony, we talked about 1 in 5 children in our country living in poverty on average, and in many of the communities that were circled by the opportunity zones, it was 3 of 10 or even half the children in poverty. So I sit here today thinking that we need to pay it forward. We need to invest in education and workforce. And so, yes, we have to make our choices, but I think when I'm talking today to educators, they can't get their kids educated because there's not enough housing. Doctors can't keep their patients healthy because there's not enough housing and education. These things all play together. So I do think that it's really important that we work with private sector, with the government to establish the public-private partnerships that recognize that these problems are connected, and we need to work together to drive outcomes in a really clear, comprehensive way. And I think you've hit on some of the most important priority areas that we can invest in, and I think our future truly depends on it.
I won't try to get any of you in trouble on this by having to agree with me, but I think implicitly you're arguing that given that our entitlement programs are overwhelmingly focused on senior citizens, and we have, compared to life expectancy, the earliest retirement of any civilization ever, there's some pretty serious misalignment between where we're investing and what we need. The Senate has just called a vote, and the chairman is going to gavel me out, so thank you three for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to be here and appear before the committee today. This testimony has been wonderful, and I just want to remind that should members wish to submit questions for the record, the hearing record will remain open for 5 business days, and with that, our committee is adjourned.
Thank you.